I've made this arrangement in a vintage vase, sometimes called a windowsill vase or a mantelpiece vase. It's quite long and narrow. I've decided not to use flower foam, so I've made a chicken wire grid using Floristry stub wires. Have you got a vase like this at home? They're really quite fashionable at the moment. You might know them as windowsill vases or mantelpiece vases. They're quite long and very narrow. I'm Julie from Julie Davis Flower Workshops and Flower Start, the online flower arranging classes. You might find though you've got a problem when you arrange your flowers because they fall around because the mouth of your container is just so large. You could of course use flower foam, but nowadays people are moving away from using that single-use plastic. I'll show you how, by using some Floristry wires, you can create your own mesh grid and arrange your flowers through those. To make your wire mesh, you're going to need some Floristry stub wires. These wires don't have the plastic coating on them, so when you work with them you're going to get really mucky fingers, but it doesn't matter whether you use the bare wires or the plastic coated ones. These Floristry wires are a 0.90 wire. You could also use a 0.71 wire, but the finer the wire, the less robust your resultant mesh would be. I'm going to start by twisting two of my wires together, starting at the end, crossing one wire over the other, and twist them in place 3 or 4 times. I'm going to repeat that a few more times until I've got the length of the piece of mesh that I want. You can see how dirty my fingers are starting to get already. So I've wired up, twisted up 6 pieces of wire so far. If I lay those out, you'll be able to see them, and then you can start to imagine what the mesh is going to look like. So at this stage it's going to get quite complicated because we're working with more than 2 wires at a time. I'm going to try and make it easier by just having 2 sets of wires, and you can see here where they cross is going to be the next place for my next twist. And then this becomes my next wire. Lay the next one over the top and twist again. Then using this wire, add in the next group of wires, and where they cross, twist. So every piece of wire is joined to every other piece of wire. So I've got my initial twists along here and then my second row of twists along here. So I'm going to go back to the beginning and start twisting again. So the first 2 wires I twist together, and then the next group, and you can see how the mesh is starting to develop. Next 2 unattached wires, and then the next 2 wires, and continue on to reach the end of that row. Then start back at the beginning again. So this time I'm going to leave this wire here and take these 2. more rows and twists you add, the more rigid your mesh becomes. But you will need to measure up against your vase or your container to see how much more of the mesh you need to create. So I'm going to use this bowl here that I bought from a junk shop several years ago. It only cost me £1 because it's got this huge chip here. And on the back it says HO Birmingham 4968. So I shall see whether my mesh fits. That's looking pretty good, but I do need to be able to fold the mesh over on the edges so it catches and holds in place. So what I'm going to do is add on some more wires here, another row, just so I've got plenty to work with. I'm ready to attach my last wire here. So all my extension wires have been added. Now what I'm going to do next is to go back in and just cut off the excess wire so I can see where I'm working. So I've added my extension wires, I've cut off my loose ends just to neaten things up a little bit, but look how dirty my hands are now. And I've also cut myself, so do be really careful. And then we continue on, grouping the wires together, continue to make more twists and a wider piece of mesh. It does get quite tricky when you've got long wires that you need to deal with. Just remember you're thinking of pairing up the wires. So just try and concentrate on 2 wires at once. So carry on twisting until you get to the end. I think probably I can get one more row of twists along here. And here's my completed mesh, which again once more just measure up for size. You can see that I've got plenty of room there for wrapping the mesh over the edges and securing it in place. I do just need to watch out though for these spiky bits, as I don't want them cutting into the stems of my flowers or scratching me again. So I'm going to make sure I really tuck those out of the way. I'll also take the opportunity for curling the ends of the chicken wire up here as well, just so there aren't any scratchy bits. You bend it over with your pliers and you can roll it round. It gives a bit of a decorative finish at the same time as well. There's my finished mesh. I've neatened off all the edges and just tucked away and pinched down with my pliers where I needed to, just so there aren't any snaggy bits of wire to catch me or my flowers. So I'm all ready now to add that to my container and push it down and shape it so it'll be fixed, and that'll be supporting my flowers. Having made your chicken wire, the next thing to do is to put it on top of your container and get it to hold in place. And the easiest way to do this is to push down quite lightly, and then as the little bits of wire flip up, bend them over so they catch over the edge of your container. And you can see that that gives you quite a little decorative trim. You can either keep to show off your handiwork or hide when you add your greenery and your flowers. The next thing I need to do is add water. I'm going to be using garden greenery in my arrangement and a few flowers for my garden, and then I'll just see what it looks like, and I may add some supermarket flowers as well. This is Arum Pictum Italicum. It's got a lovely veined appearance to it. I like the way as well it's like a little shelf, and that'd be really great for putting in my vase, and it'll float over the edge of the container and start to hide some of this wire work. Recut the stems and add in. I like to group my greenery together so it's in a little cluster. As I've got quite a lot of these leaves, I'll put some in at the other side as well. These big leaves work really well because they really do start to cover up that mesh wire work, so it's not always on show. I'm going to add in some Fatsia leaves next. These are, again, I think they were a house plant that got liberated into the garden, and because we're growing it ourselves, I'm able to pick them at different sizes, so it's nice to get some variation in size as well as variation in your type of greenery. So again, recut the stems and feed them into your arrangement. I'm going to have one big one on this side and the two smaller on the other side. Just seeing there whether I can encourage that to bend over the edge of the container a little bit. And I've also got one more big leaf, and that is the begonia. This is quite long, and actually I might tuck that down underneath that Fatsia because it is a bit bigger. It's curving over the container a little bit more. Common old ivy. I've got this growing over a fence at the bottom of the garden, and I've picked this because I liked the fact it was bushy but also trailed as well. So again, recut the stems and add that in, again, near the front so it can nestle down. And I really like the connection between the container and the vase, so you see it all as one arrangement and not flowers with a separate vase. So you can see how that's starting to fill out. If I turn it round, it's a little bit gappy at the back, so I'll start to add in some greenery at the back as well. And for this, I'm going to fill in using Choisia, which is a bush with quite a distinctive smell, sometimes known as mock orange, and it's just getting some white flower buds developing. As I've got quite a few of these, I'm going to put them in a diagonal line, sort of meandering their way through the arrangement. I've kept everything quite low here, but if you had some interesting greenery, perhaps some twigs, you could come up in a more asymmetrical form. So it's a study at the moment, a tapestry of all different colours, textures and foliages. The only flowers I've got growing in my garden at the moment, well, actually they're not even growing, they've totally dried out, and these are sedum stems from the ice plant. So the new growth is just developing, and it's just about the right time of the year to be deadheading them because the insects and bugs have been able to overwinter. And I've also got some hellebores as well. They're almost like a greenery in themselves, a lovely soft pinky greenness variety, and I've picked them with a really mature flower head in them, leaning across and hoping you can see that. If you pick them too soon, they flop over really quickly. They don't like really being cut and put in water. As my hellebores have got reasonably long stemmed, I'll be able to get them to hover out over the top of the arrangement. I've set my hellebores in a rough line. They're sort of curving through from this side and then returning back through the other side. But really just choose somewhere where you think they show off really well. And because they're quite a dainty flower, similar in colour to the rest of the greenery, you need to make sure they stand out. So raising them up a little bit higher works, and also putting them across a greenery where they really contrast with what's underneath. And now for these dried stems. I'm going to turn the vase towards me now so I can really see what I'm doing. So I can be a bit more daring with the sedums because they're dried out. They don't actually need to be in water, so I can just balance them and prop them and they can defy gravity. They're a little bit dark, so they're probably not going to show up against the greenery, but close up I will be able to enjoy them. And this one's got a very slight curve, so I think I'll see if I can replicate the curve of the high hellebore over there. As long as everything stays still, it'll be fine. You're the designer, so you make an arrangement that pleases you. I've propped up these hellebores against the sedum heads, and because they are multi-stemmed, a bit like a cauliflower head or a broccoli head, you can nudge your flower stems in between those branch sections and they'll support it a little bit. And now for some flowers. Now everything you've got here is quite dark, so this is where it's really handy to put bright pops of colour in, you know, whites and the yellows and the soft pinks. This is Snapdragon from a supermarket bunch. Now I just need to make sure I'm looking at the right part of the arrangement. I'm spinning the front back to me again. And you'll see when I add this in that the colour is just amazing. It really will lift the whole arrangement. Now the problem with supermarket flowers is you only get 1 or 2 stems of each flower. Imagine making this arrangement in the summer when you've got a whole garden of flowers to choose from. And some lovely roses for the other side. Putting my biggest headed rose right in the centre. And as you can see, the more bright colours you use, the more the arrangement stands out. And you just keep adding and adding and adding. I've got a stem of lily here. It's probably a bit too big, but what I'll do is cut it. And then it gives me 2 sections to work with. Just make sure that when you've got short stems that they are reaching down into the water. So you'll need to check every few days whether you need to add more water into your container. You don't want your flowers dying off prematurely because you've neglected to give them a good water. And these lilies that will really open out in the next couple of days, and probably as my hellebores mature I'll need to pull out those as they go over, and then the lilies will take their place. I've got a few bloom chrysanthemums as well, but I don't think they really fit in with the colour palette. What I've got here is quite coppery, brownish tones, from the brown of the sedum to almost the browny tones of the lily as well, and the fleshy reverse of the hellebore. And I think if I add in another colour, it might clash a little bit. I think I'm going to leave it like that now. I'll take a photo and add that in to the end of the video.